my vice chair and other members to also make an opening statement. Today is the 7th hearing, oversight hearing on the High-Speed Rail Authority, which has been held by the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee. We began in December of 2007, and so we're now talking about almost 3 years, and this is the 7th hearing. And this hearing is the result of a request that Senator Huff and I made to the Joint Legislative Audit Committee to have the State Bureau of Audits conduct a performance audit of the High-Speed Rail Authority. Ms. Elaine Howell, the state auditor, will present the findings today of the audit, and a representative from the authority will present the agency's view of the audit. Let me begin by saying anybody who has read this audit report, and I've been briefed on it and then went through it last night, cannot help and went through to be disheartened by the authority's mismanagement, or at least some folks' mismanagement of scarce public resources. The litany of poor management practices identified by the auditor is actually astounding. Paying undocumented invoices, asking consultants to work outside of the terms of their contracts, inappropriately buying furniture for a contractor, lack of management system, and then when procedures were adopted, failure to implement them, and many more findings that were disturbing. It's kind of interesting. I think about, before I came to the legislature, I was a faculty member at Cal State Long Beach, and I actually oversaw and did a number of grants and projects, some of those with the state of California, where I applied for these grants and my students and other faculty members worked on. The state would never have allowed us to do what the High-Speed Rail Authority to do undocumented. I mean, we watched and made sure we documented everything because the state came down and asked us to document everything. So it's kind of interesting how when it's ourselves, when it's the state that's being asked, that documentation, or at least an agency of the state. In addition, that we don't engage in the same processes that we ask others to do. In addition to weak management practices, the audit underscores the fact that the authority's financing plan, that's the second part of the thing, is unrealistic. It's unrealistic in the sense of how do we know that this money will or will not exist? It relies on at least $15 billion of federal funds. It expects local governments to contribute $4.4 billion and expects $11 billion of private funds, but it never lays out any scenarios if that money doesn't occur, and where, it just says it's going to be there. We don't know if it is or if it's not, whether it's real, and we don't know what those scenarios and what corridors will or will not be impacted by the availability of these funds. And the audit concludes in that there's no basis in all of these assumptions, and that recommends that we also, as I just pointed out, that the authority prepare alternative funding scenarios that reflect the possibility of reduced or delayed funding. The program findings of the audit are consistent with the findings of our previous oversight hearings of this committee, and that is that whether we're talking about the business plan or now this audit, the High-Speed Rail Authority does not really have at this point, a coherent program and needs one desperately. I think the title of the audit summarizes the problems that the legislature must address. The High-Speed Rail Authority, it risks delays or an incomplete system because of inadequate planning, weak oversight, and lacks contract management. And before we ask our first witness, Ms. Howell, our state auditor, to present the findings, I'd like to ask first Senator Huff if you'd like to make an opening comment, and then Senator Simitian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Lowenthal and I asked for this audit not because we wanted to spank the authority, but that we wanted to make sure that there were good guidelines in place and we're setting off in the right direction as we embark upon the largest public works project in the state. And the audit report did contain information that is of concern to us, which we will hear in more detail and have the opportunity to ask questions. But I hope we can all look at this as basically going to the doctor's office and getting the right prescription so that we can get healthy and not get worse, because that certainly was the intent of the audit. I know that just the term audit triggers sort of a negative response in anybody, particularly those who were being audited. But it was, we are all supporters of the high-speed rail. We want it to be successful. And that really is the whole purpose of the audit and this meeting. And so I hope it's kept it in context. There were some material findings here which we'll go through, but the High-Speed Rail Authority has also been acting on these even as the audit was going on and afterwards. This data was gathered several months ago, so it's not, current practices, but we hope to see an improvement, and this will certainly help underscore some of the committee's concerns and also some of the auditor's concerns. So appreciate the work's done, look forward to hearing it, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Simitian, do you wish to say anything?
I share many of the concerns that you've already expressed, Mr. Chairman, and Vice Chairman Huff as well, so I won't belabor or repeat them. I do want to say this. I think we're at a place now where the concerns that have been expressed by individuals, interest groups around the state, certainly constituents in various parts of the state, have now been legitimized, if that's the best word, by both the legislative analyst report and the audit. And my hope would be that at this point, folks would stop being in denial about the cause for concern and come to the conclusion that if you've got thoughtful, well-intended constituent concern that is backed by the concern of this committee and the budget subcommittee on which you and I sit, Mr. Chairman, which is backed by the LAO, which is backed by the audit, at some point, I think folks really do need to come to grips with the fact that this isn't just a case of isolated concern or misguided complaint or rampant NIMBYism. There are real and legitimate concerns here, and they need to be addressed sooner rather than later. And the only way I can put a handle around this is to say I have consistently described myself as a supporter of high-speed rail, but high-speed rail done right. I supported high-speed rail from my first day in the legislature 10 years ago. I have supported it every opportunity since. I voted against a 4-year delay in placing the measure on the ballot. In spite of a considerable constituent concern in my district, I continue to call myself a supporter of high-speed rail done right. We are getting very close to the point where if there are not significant changes and improvements in the way business is done, I will no longer be able to call myself a supporter of high-speed rail done right. And once members start to back away in that way, not any individual member, but I think more than a few, I think it puts the project in great jeopardy. So I think time is very short indeed, and we're getting pretty quickly to the place where if the acknowledgement isn't real, and more importantly, the corrective steps aren't real and dramatic, I think the project puts itself in serious jeopardy.
Thank you. With that, I welcome our first speaker, the State Auditor. Welcome to our committee, Ms. Howell.
Thank you, Senator. For the record, my name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. To my right is Jim Sandberg-Larson. Jim was the project manager on this particular project, so when you have the tough questions, I'll defer to him. But what I would like to do is step through the actual findings that we had. We issued this report just last month in April. This was a request, as you indicated, Mr. Chair. You and Senator Huff asked the Joint Legislative Audit Committee to approve this audit. We commenced the audit this past fall, and as I indicated, issued a report in April. We have a variety of issues that we identified in the audit report. First of all, looking at the authority's business plan and whether or not that plan had specific details as far as how they intended to finance the particular program. And we felt that the plan lacked sufficient detail regarding how it intended to finance it. For example, the authority is estimating that they need between $17 and $19 billion in federal funds for this particular project. But as we're all aware at this point in time, the amount that the federal government thus far has committed is through the Recovery Act money, and that's about $2.25 billion. billion. So there's a significant difference there. In addition, in their business plan, they intend for the preliminary spending of federal and state dollars through approximately 2013, 2014 to be primarily federal and state dollars, about $12 billion. And that's about 2.5 times the amount that is currently available for this particular project. So again, they're far short of what their goals are for spending, certainly in the first few years. In addition, they intend to have private investment in this particular project. Upwards of $10 to $12 billion is what they're estimating from private investors. But again, these investors are requiring some type of either a revenue guarantee or a guarantee from operating surpluses that this is going to be a well-functioning system. So even though there has been interest expressed by private investors, they're holding off to make sure that this thing really gets up and running. Risk management was an area that we would have expected to see more detail in their business plan about how they intend to manage risk. So we had some recommendations related to that. There are very specific requirements in Proposition 1A with regard to funding and accounting for funds. There's a certain amount, and I'm going to touch on all of these issues in more detail, but there's a certain amount that they can spend on administration, certain amount they can spend on pre-construction, which is essentially environmental planning type things. And we have concerns about whether or not they have systems in place to even track accurately the amounts that they are spending on these types of activities. Looking at their process for awarding contracts, we felt that their process for awarding contracts was fine, looking at some architectural and engineering contracts. However, when we looked to see how well they were monitoring those contracts, that's where we saw the weaknesses. We felt that they really needed to strengthen some of the performance and accountability over those contracts. In particular, we looked at a major contract that the authority has with what's called a program manager. This is a manager that is intended to provide feedback to the authority as far as progress reporting, overseeing the regional contractors to make sure that things are happening appropriately, the status of the various projects throughout the state. And we saw that those monthly progress reports were inaccurate, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. Inconsistent information was being sent to the authority. So we really had some concerns about this contract with this program manager. It's a significant contract, it's a $199 million contract for them to provide oversight. As you indicated, Mr. Chair, we sampled some invoices that had been paid by the authority to regional contractors, and we had a very high rate of concern there. We looked at 22 invoices. For 20 of those invoices, we didn't see anybody making sure that the deliverables and the work had been confirmed, that the work had been done. So again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then the final issue, as you indicated in your opening statement as well, is there were some payments for services that were outside the scope of work for some of the regional contractors and the program manager. And I'll get into specifics on those as well. So a variety of issues, certainly concerns about the business plan, concerns about their administrative practices, the oversight and monitoring of these contracts. So kind of in a nutshell, the overall administration and management of this particular project. So starting with the first issue related to the business plan, as I indicated, they have modified their business plan. They published their first plan way back in 2000, created a modification in 2008, again in March of 2009. LAO had some concerns with that business plan, so they modified it again, and at the legislature's direction needed to have that modified plan completed by December of 2009. They did that. We looked at that plan, and it does include updated cost estimates. It has some route selections. It has some information in it, but again, we had some concerns about the specificity, specifically looking at how they intend to finance this particular project overall. Their estimated funding needed for Phase 1, which would be only a portion of the high rail system, or high-speed rail system, is they're currently estimating the overall cost for that phase, which would be from San Francisco to Anaheim, to be $42.6 billion. And again, keep in mind what I was just talking about a few minutes ago. There's Recovery Act money of $2.25 billion. The voters approved Proposition 1A in November of 2008 for another $9 billion. So there's there's only a certain amount of funding available at this point in time. So they really are relying on expectations of more federal money coming in. As I indicated, they're estimating 17 to 19 billion, but without specifics as to where those federal dollars are going to come from. And our concerns are based on a few things. Looking at work that our congressional equivalent did, the U.S. Government Accountability Office indicated that there isn't a specific funding or dedicated federal source for these types of projects beyond the Recovery Act money that's already been awarded. So projects like high-speed rail, not only in California but in other states, are going to be competing for other federal dollars and other programs that are seeking those dollars. We believe competition will be extremely strong throughout the country for any federal money. This was evidenced by the Recovery Act applications. $8 billion was awarded by the federal government. The applications totaled $57 billion. So there's great interest, not only in California, but in other states in building high-speed rail. With regard to the Proposition 1A funding, the $9 billion that was approved by the voters, there's a limitation in that the bond language, and that says that those bond funds may only be used to support up to 50%. So essentially, we have about $4.5 billion available because we have the $2.25 billion available via the Recovery Act. You match that with some of the Prop 1A money, that's $4.5 billion. Again, our concern is, in looking at some of the segments in the corridors, the least expensive corridor is LA to Anaheim. That's $5.5 billion. So we're already $1 billion short of the least expensive corridor, if that's the one that's constructed first. There are some specific requirements in state law that the authority has to have a plan that estimates full cost of construction, identifies all the sources of funding, anticipated receipt of those funds, et cetera. This has to be reviewed by finance. So again, this is something that the authority is going to need to be focused on and continue to work on, particularly since the federal government is going to be expecting to see a funding plan by the spring of 2008, because those federal dollars need to be obligated, essentially committed to specific parts of the project by the fall of 2011. So that's a year and a half from now. So there really is quite a bit of work that the authority needs to do relative to coming up with a specific funding plan and perhaps identifying alternative funding sources. As I indicated, their plans for private funding seem vague to us. Private investors certainly have expressed interest in the program. There's no doubt about that, but there have been no commitments at this point in time. And the authority is expecting that private industry or private investors will require a revenue guarantee to participate in this program. But we didn't see anything more specific in the business plan or the financing plan as to how that's going to go about. Part of the vision is that in the event we have operating surpluses, that would assist. But if there are not operating surpluses and those surplus projections aren't met, private investors will require a revenue guarantee. But we don't know what the source of that guarantee is going to be. It was not specified in the business plan. So again, kind of feeding into risk management. What are some of the alternatives that the High-Speed Rail Authority is looking at as far as if some of these funding sources don't come about, what's the plan? What's Plan B? There have been concerns in the past, I know, about the ridership model. We did not specifically look at the ridership model in detail, but in the audit report we did indicate that the authority has contracted with UC Davis to have them refine some of their forecasting models. In addition to that, as a result of a request of, I think it was this committee, the authority has actually entered into a contract with UC Berkeley to have them peer review what UC Davis is doing and what this ridership model and what these forecasts are going to look like. So there is going to be some additional oversight there. I think that will be helpful. Risk management, I already discussed. We had some concerns there. There's very little that describes in their risk management plan how they're going to monitor or control risk. They have taken some recent steps, as recent as March of this year, to revise some of their risk management processes, to come up with some protocols, but again, it's in the very early stages, so that's something the authority needs to continue to focus on as far as trying to mitigate any risks, or identify risks and certainly mitigate those. As far as a strategic plan, we were expecting to see a strategic plan completed by the authority. At the time we conducted the audit work, they had a draft plan And it did include most of the key elements that are expected to be seen in a strategic plan, such as a mission statement, goals and objectives, a vision, et cetera. We didn't see action plans. And that's something we would have expected to see. So the authority is focusing on their strategic plan. They were expecting to have it completed in April of this year. We finished our field work earlier than that, so I would defer to the authority to let the committee know whether or not the strategic plan has been completed. But when we asked about the action plans and implementation plans, they indicated that they would not have those completed until July of this year. So again, the authority may be able to give you an update on that. One of the things that struck us as far as looking at the development of the strategic plan, we would have expected to see the authority, the board itself, to be more actively involved in the development and review of the strategic plan, and we didn't see evidence of that happening. So their involvement had been relatively limited. They participated in a survey when the plan was initially being developed, but we really didn't see them overseeing the plan and providing significant feedback as far as how the plan should be drafted and what would be included in that. In looking at their oversight and their administrative controls, there are certain things that we, again, had concerns about. One thing is there's a peer review group that is statutorily required. It's defined as an advisory group. There are certain members of this advisory group that have been appointed. It's supposed to be an 8-member advisory group. At this point in time, 5 members have been appointed. Some of these appointments are made by the state treasurer, the state controller's office, business, transportation, and housing. We reached out to both the controller and the treasurer. And did we talk to BT&H too? Do you remember? All 3 of those entities to find out when they intended, if they were working. And they were all working hard and trying to identify individuals. The difficulty is the qualifications to be a member of this advisory group are very, very specific, and they should be. So they were actively working on that. But we think it's very important that this peer review group be put together in totality. The 5 members who are on the group right now certainly have provided some feedback to the authority, but we think it would be much more beneficial to have the full 8 individuals because they are required to provide independent assessments of the feasibility of the funding plans, looking at some of the assumptions the authority has. So they're really kind of, as it's called, a peer review group to really take a hard look at what some of the authority's expectations are or what their vision is. And looking at their administrative systems, again, as far as Proposition 1A, I mentioned there is a specific requirement in the proposition that limits the amount of funding that can be spent on administration. The percentage is 2.5%, so it's about $225 million that the authority can use for administrative costs. Another 10%, about $900 million, can be used for what's called pre-construction. It's environmental, planning, those types of things. Our concern is that the authority has not set up a system where they can specifically identify what's administrative and what's not. So we were seeing that they were expecting to have spent $168 million by the end of this fiscal year. But they wouldn't be able to tell us 60 million of that is administrative, 100 million of that is administrative. So we really needed to see and have recommended that the Commission specify what's an administrative cost and what is not, and make sure that they have the ability to track that, because they will eventually hit that threshold. And a concern we raised in the report is we don't want to hit that threshold too soon and cause problems for this particular project. The Recovery Act has very specific requirements in it with regard to tracking expenditures. You are required, every state agency, as we've been auditing them, is required to track Recovery Act funds separate from any other federal monies that they receive. We weren't seeing systems set up by the authority to do that. The other concern, the other issue that the authority really needs to address is their ability to report any jobs that were created or are funded by Recovery Act monies coming in to support high-speed rail. And those are specific requirements in the Recovery Act for all recipients of Recovery Act dollars. So that's something else the authority needs to pay attention to and work on. As I indicated, the authority itself, the board, had not been very involved in development of the strategic plan. We also saw some other areas where we felt their involvement had been somewhat limited. They did not discuss or approve as a body the business plan that was completed in December and submitted to the legislature. They each received a copy about the same time it was distributed to others. So they didn't convene as a body to discuss this revised business plan. Now, the chair of the authority has stepped up recently, actually last fall, I take that back, and has been requiring staff to provide weekly reports. And those were reports intended to provide program status. Where are we at on certain things? Kind of a weekly snapshot of what the progress has been with regard to this particular project. During the time frame that we selected, we looked at August 09 through March of 2010. We would have expected to see 29, that's 29-week window, we would have said 29 weekly reports, and we only found that 12 of those weekly reports had been done. So here's a control or a process that had been put in place that was not being properly managed and properly monitored. We think it's a good process, but again, if you put a control in place, you need to make sure that you're exercising that control. The authority also created some committees, kind of subcommittees, an operations committee, a finance committee, an executive administrative committee. But when we looked to see if they had had meetings, the executive administrative committee is the only one that really held their first 4 scheduled meetings. The finance committee canceled its first meeting. The operations committee had scheduled 4 meetings, but they only held 2. So again, kind of sporadically implementing some of the oversight and management that they had intended to do. And looking at contracting and internal controls, again, looking at accountability. Awarding of the contracts, as I said earlier, the architectural and engineering contracts, they really did meet the specific requirements in statute. As I'm sure you're aware, these contracts have to be awarded to the most qualified bidder or the most qualified firm rather than the lowest responsible bidder, which is traditional in state contracting. When we looked at that, we felt that they really did follow those procedures as far as that was concerned. And it's very important because architectural and engineering contracts have accounted for a significant amount, 87% of the authority's payments for a 3-year window, fiscal years 6-7 through 8-9. So a lot of expenditures for these regional contractors. The program manager, again, as I indicated, this is a firm that the authority hired to really communicate the status of the program and whether or not we're staying on track. The types of things we would have expected to see in these monthly reports that this program manager is supposed to provide would be status of current work, planned work versus work that's been completed, budgeted versus actual cost, budgeted versus actual hours completed, and then identification of any critical issues, things that they need to bring to the attention of the authority, the executive management of the authority as well as the board. But when we looked at these monthly reports that the program manager had provided, we found inconsistencies, inaccurate information. I'll give you a couple of examples. We looked at one for the regional contractor for the LA to Anaheim corridor. The plan was to have 65% of the technical work completed. 7% was complete as of June 30th, 09. It also intended to finish 60% of its design, but had only completed 20%. When we looked at the monthly progress report, this was not raised as an issue or a concern by the program manager, so it was not brought to the attention of the authority. In addition, when we looked at the July report for this same regional contractor, LA to Anaheim corridor again, the contractor had worked about 81% of the hours planned. But when you look at the expenditures incurred, the expenditures were 230% of planned. So you're doing 80% of the work, charging 230% of the expected costs. And again, we weren't seeing this raised as a concern by the program manager to the authority or the executive management of the authority. And then the last concern we had related to progress reports is they just were not providing status of promised goods and services. So it would refer to actions taken and projects created, but it wouldn't compare that to what was expected, what was actually planned for. So again, we had some pretty significant concerns with these monthly progress reports. And keep in mind, this program manager was hired, a consultant was hired, and that's their primary responsibility, is to oversee the regional contractors and report on a monthly basis back to the authority. The authority has recently taken action in January of 2010 to address this concern. They've actually hired another contractor, and that's not to oversee the program manager. So they've executed a contract in January of 2010. That contract continues through 2013, and what this individual or this firm will be doing is overseeing what the program manager, the other firm, is doing. And then the final couple of areas, and then I'll finish off with the recommendations, is, again, looking at some of the payments that were made by the authority, and we're concerned that invoices are being paid without any assurance that the work's been completed, that what we're paying for is what we expected. And as I indicated earlier, we just pulled a sample of 22 contracts, or 22 invoices, excuse me. 20 of those didn't have any documentation or any, support to confirm that this is work that's been completed, the payment's appropriate, we should be paying these funds out. These 20 invoices totaled about $6.9 million, and there's an important distinction in here. $2.9 million of those payments were made prior to them establishing a control. They actually did establish a control. And said there needs to be written notification from the program manager, again, who's overseeing these regional contractors, that yes, this invoice is proper, I'm giving you the approval to pay, we've seen the deliverables, we're convinced that, or we've been given evidence to support the fact that this work has been done. Even after that control was put in place, some of the invoices that we looked at, $4 million worth of invoices, were paid without that written notification, that written assurance that it's okay to pay this particular invoice. Another control that's put in place that's not being utilized. In addition, we saw the authority paying the program manager's invoices without reviewing them to ensure they reflected work performed as well. And as I indicated, they've now hired a consultant back in January to review what the program manager is doing. And then the final area that we had concerns about, again, is related to payments. And some of these were payments for work that was outside the scope of the particular contractor's work plan. One example, the program manager. The program manager was asked to work on the applications to apply for the Recovery Act funds. This was not within the original scope of work, so they paid the program manager $53,000 to assist in preparing the applications for the Recovery Act funds that California ultimately received. And then there were a couple of other examples where services, again, outside the contractor's work plan was done, and then the furniture purchase, that again was for the program manager. The written contract requires the program manager to provide their own furniture. Not a significant amount of money, but again, our concern is we're paying for things that are certainly precluded in that particular case in the written contract, paying for things outside the scope of work, and paying for things without assurance that work has been done and we've received the value for what we're paying for. So that leads us to recommendations. With regard to funding, we believe that the authority should develop and publish alternative funding scenarios that could reflect the possibility of reduced or delayed funding. Again, as I talked, $17 to $19 billion from the federal government, $10 to $12 billion from private investors. Certainly Prop 1A money, the voters approved that. Specify the potential costs of the revenue guarantee. Look for more ways to try to mitigate and manage any risks associated with this particular project. Establish a system for tracking those expenditures that are required to be limited under Proposition 1A. Again, the administrative expenditures, pre-construction expenditures, and also systems to make sure that they can track Recovery Act monies and be able to report the specific information that the Recovery Act requires. We encourage the authority, the board itself, to participate in these key policy documents, a business plan, finishing up the strategic plan, those sorts of things. We think the consultant, the oversight consultant that was hired to review the program manager's work, there should specifically be a requirement that they review those progress reports, make sure they're accurate, they're consistent, and have them review all of that work before the program manager, the invoices for the program manager are paid. adhere to controls. I mean, they've established some controls that we think will be worthwhile, but a control is only as good as the people that are going to exercise that control. So we've saw some controls put in place, but they're not following them. They need to follow those controls. And then final, to adhere to conditions in contracts and work plans. If there's additional work, then you need to amend the contract so that you're not asking contractors to do work that's outside the scope of their existing work plan. And then ensure written policies and procedures reflect the intended controls over invoicing, and provide guidance to staff so that they know what the expectations are, what the controls are, what practices they should be engaging in, to make sure that we can provide assurance that what we're paying for are things that we've actually received as an entity, or the authority has received. That's kind of in a nutshell all the audit results. One thing, just for your information, members, and you may all be familiar with this, is anytime we issue an audit report, we do have a follow-up process. I mean, the authority certainly provided its initial response to the report. 60 days from the date the report was published, we'll be expecting to see another response from them, and it should be specific to each of the recommendations that we've made. Again, 6 months after that and 1 year after that. We certainly have the ability to ask for more frequent. That's our standing practice, 60 days, 6 months, 1 year. But we certainly, if the committee desires, we could ask for more frequent periodic reporting from the authority itself. So with that, I'll attempt to answer any questions members may have.
Yeah. Let me just jump in and ask a few questions. I have a couple of questions, and then maybe other members can kind of jump in. First thing, general area that just strikes me is the whole area around this program manager. We realized that the authority and the board had few resources early on to hire their own staff, and they've kind of been ramping up. And so they paid the largest single contract, which was almost $200 million, to have a program manager oversee all the contracts and do that. And as you pointed out in your report, there are some serious deficiencies in what the program manager paid or didn't pay and the documentation. So my first question is there any way that the state or the authority can recover some of the money that they paid to the program manager for their obvious fact that they paid for bills without any documentation? Should we be paying for that? That was what the program manager was supposed to do, and you pointed out that they just didn't do it. And then you said they actually put into place controls which they never followed. Why are we paying for that? Why is the authority paying for that? And should they be paying that program manager?
Well, I think going forward, certainly the authority needs to make sure that they're satisfied with what they're seeing before they pay the program manager, and the program manager needs to provide much more evidence than we were seeing before any of these invoices are paid for regional contractors. Now, whether or not the authority can go back and say to the program manager, we weren't satisfied with your performance, and try to recoup any payments made.
Shouldn't they say to them whether they can recoup that? We are not satisfied with your performance. You were expected to do this. You put into place controls. You never followed your own controls. And the next question is about that. And so what the question is what could, and they never received reports from the program manager until the chair recently introduced, it just seems to me there should be some general dissatisfaction with this program manager and what they've done, and that some leverage should be made by the authority to the management saying this is totally unacceptable.
Well, Senator, I would agree, and I want to make a distinction that the program manager is required to provide those monthly progress reports, and the evidence we saw is they were very poorly done. They were inconsistent, they were inaccurate. I absolutely agree that the authority should and has the ability to let that program manager, at this point in time, we're not satisfied with the performance we're seeing, and this is what the expectation is that from this day forward. Now, as far as
they don't meet that, these are grounds for, if they set that up, for ending this contract? I'm just saying if they're not satisfied.
Well, can I ask, in the original contract with the program manager, was there provision along the lines of what Senator Lowenthal is suggesting, that if the benchmarks are not met, accurately, consistently, the findings that you made, that there would be an opportunity, some mechanism for adjusting the compensation to the program manager under their contract to recoup those funds?
I'm not sure.
We would have to go back, and we have a copy of the contract. We could go back and look at, and traditionally when you have a contract, you have a termination clause, and usually that's for, not satisfied with the service that's being provided. But to specifically...
How about errors and omissions? I mean, so you would be willing to go back and take a look at...
We have the contract in our working papers as evidence, so we could go back and look at that certainly and report back to the committee as to what is specifically, or you could ask the authority. Either way, we could go in there and take a look at it, or you could request, like I said, the authority to provide that. But I would assume that this contract, like any you would expect to see in a contract, reasons for termination and lack of performance or unsatisfactory performance. I don't know the specific, Senator, of what that termination clause says, but I think also if there's an interest in looking back, I think the authority could certainly ask the program manager to say, here's some evidence that the state auditor identified. We need you to go back to these regional contracts. We want to be convinced that what we paid for, we want to see some deliverables or some kind of progress report that says what we paid for these various invoices. And that's something I think that's
following
reasonable.
up on that, you sampled 22 invoices, and of those you found that 20 were deficient in the documentation. This was just a small sample of.
That's correct.
Does this indicate that we should be looking at all, or you should be looking at all the invoices? Now, I mean, over 90% of the invoices where there's no documentation. Money was paid without knowing whether the job was completed, what was done, the quality of the work. Nobody signed off on it. They just paid the invoices.
Right.
Shouldn't we be looking at everything now?
Well, I think that's what you have the program manager for, should be reviewing these invoices, providing written assurance. That's the control they put in place. But I would agree with you, when you sample 22 invoices and you have concerns about 20, that's huge. Usually you would expect an error rate very, very small. So that was a major concern. Now, we could have selected more invoices, but we were convinced at that point in time, when looking at 22 invoices and you have 20 that are problematic, that you have an issue, a reportable issue. So the portion of that particular finding that's most disappointing to us is that they put a control in place which we think is workable and would provide assurance, and that's the written notification, the expectation on the authority's part that the program manager is making sure that I received an invoice from this contractor for this type of work. I've seen the evidence either in the form of a deliverable or some type of progress report from that regional contractor that work has completed. Then it's okay to pay.
Right. You see, the part that's shocking to me, and now I'll talk about something else besides the program manager, is that the authority found, after possibly because of this or maybe because of other data that was coming in terms of the progress reports, in terms of the relationship between the new board and the program manager, that things were not done right. It seemed like they had lost, as you have pointed, some confidence in the program manager, and rather than setting standards or getting rid of the program manager, they hired somebody else oversight. So now we have rather than deal with the problem, we've now hired somebody else to kind of another expense rather than dealing with the issue. So I'm just not sure yet that they have really dealt with the issue at hand, and that is the adequacy and whether they're getting a product from this program manager that really reflects this huge contract that they're receiving.
Mr. Chairman, can I add on to your question? And that has to do with, this is a look back. We just have the announcement of a new chief executive officer. It appears that the qualifications of this individual are very high. So obviously, I think we all have high expectations. So the question would be to the auditor, are there mechanisms in place for the authority through its new executive officer and obviously the board to take a look at both that program manager contract and the subsequent contract for the overseeing of the program manager for modification, termination? Is there a term on those contracts? Or does the board possess the authority and its new leader of the staff to look at those for a new beginning, new standards, new deliverables, timelines? And then my second question would be, what, in your opinion, if you have one, is a reasonable period of time for this new staff leader to get on the ground, to take a look at what's there, to get a feel, and then to be, obviously an individual deserves a period of time to get the lay of the land before we expect some strong recommendations back. Two questions.
With regard to your first question, I would say that any contract that's entered into, you have the ability to amend or modify that contract. I would think you also would have the ability to terminate a contract for a variety of reasons. But again, I would have to look at the individual contracts. As far as the oversight contractor, the consultant that was hired in January of 2010, staff informed me that that contract goes through June of 2013. It's an $8 million contract for that consultant to provide oversight over the program manager. Now, the program manager's contract, we have that in here. It's a $199 million contract, and the terms of that contract, it started in November of 2006, and that term expires June 30th of 2013. But again, you can go into a contract and certainly amend, modify. As far as the amount of time this executive director would need, boy, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, certainly there's got to be, I don't know anything about this individual, but taking over an organization, you would need, a few months to really understand everything that's happening, everything that's going on, who the individual folks that are reporting to you. I mean, it is true that the staff for the authority is a relatively small group of staff. At this point, they have nine and a half staff positions at the moment. I know the governor's budget, they've proposed 27 additional positions. So the new director will need, a few months to really kind of get up to speed on everything that's been happening.
The chair.
Senator Simitian.
Thank you. This, the question and the answer anticipates the one issue I wanted to raise. The sort of process and oversight issues that have been raised are important, but they are, for me, not the most important set of questions or concerns. We have, the audit speaks to, and we've certainly discussed before, concerns about the business plan, about a long-term financial plan. I've expressed concern, and the committee has, about community engagement issues and the revenue guarantees that you've described here, which have been raised previously. To follow up a little on Senator Ashburn's question, I think the question I have for myself, and I could use your guidance on, and I understand it's an opinion, and I'm going to ask the same question of the folks at the authority. I mentioned earlier that, at some point, my willingness to be a, quote, qualified supporter of high-speed rail or for high-speed rail done right runs out if we can't get these problems addressed satisfactorily. And again, for me, business plan, financial plan, community engagement, guarantee issues are key to that. What I think, trying to find a shred of good news here. The good news is these issues have now been raised. They've been raised in more than one forum, and they've been raised on a number of occasions. What is a reasonable period of time, not for a new executive to come in and sort of get, administrative procedure shipshape, but for us to expect that these issues get addressed? Because, long-term, going forward, absent that business plan, absent that financial plan, absent a successful model for community engagement, and a guarantee which does not run afoul of the requirements of the bond measure, at some point you have to just walk away and say, I'm sorry they couldn't get it done. What's a reasonable period of time for those adjustments to be made?
Well, I think that a lot of progress needs to be made in the next 6 months. And the reason I say that is because of some of the requirements, as I mentioned in my presentation, they have to have a financing plan basically established by the spring of 2011 to meet some of the federal requirements to be able to obligate those funds by the fall of 2011. So we're at May of 2010. So to have a good plan in place by less than a year from now, I would presume, and again, it's my opinion, that you're going to need to see some pretty significant progress in the next 6 months or so. And they're expecting to have their strategic plan completed. They're expecting to have some other, the other information that I was talking about that was supposed to be done in this last month. So some of the milestones that they have laid out for themselves, I would expect that those need to be met as opposed to saying, well, we need another 3 months.
All right. So, not to put words in your mouth, but if, I mean, we'll be in session for the rest of this year. We'll come back next year with a new legislature sworn in. We'll get ourselves organized. Middle of January next year, 2011. At that point, in your view, the folks who are at the helm of the authority ought to be able to give us a business plan, a financial plan, community engagement plan, and a resolution on this issue of guarantee that is satisfactory, given the fact that it's been called out and they understand clearly what the task is before them. Is that a fair recitation of what I've heard?
I think that's a fair recitation, specifically when they're so focused on federal dollars. And as I indicated, some of the planning and what the federal government is expecting to see, they need to see that in 2011. So I think your characterization is fair, yes.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I'm going to, just heads up, I'm going to be asking the authority, if they're going to be willing and able to make the commitment that they're going to have their act together on these issues by that time, because as I've mentioned at previous hearings, Mr. Chairman, the most recent budget subcommittee that you and I participated in, it feels to me like we have to drag this information and these improvements out of the authority, painful increment, one after another, rather than sort of saying we're going to get it done right and then we're going to move forward. So.
Thank you. To follow up on Senator Simiti, and as he's moved away from some of the controls and to some of the other issues around the financing plan and the inadequacy that you found in the business plan. And I want to ask you, part of the way the authority was to deal with these, to have a financing plan, was to have a peer review and to come in and look at that financing plan. And you said that they've only have 5 members have been selected so far of that peer review committee, and they've had some meetings or some input. Have they made any independent assessments of this financing plan? Have they done anything, the peer review committee?
Can you speak to that?
We're not aware of that. The authority did say that they were sent copies, but they didn't receive any feedback.
So they've never really tried to convene this or to work with them in any way? Because part of the data that the legislature needs to look at, besides from the LAO and from the auditor, is this peer review committee, which is to look at this financing plan and come back with recommendations both to the policy committees and also to the budget committee and to the authority itself. So I'm wondering, what recommendations? That was called for in AB 3034, I believe, to set up the peer review. Right. Do we need to strengthen that? Is there some recommendation? Because you do highlight some of the real problems of not having a peer review. If we're talking about having a finance committee, we don't have that peer review to give us. What can we do in the legislature to ensure that there is a functioning peer review committee of the plans that we keep saying to the authority we need more information on?
At that time, they didn't have a quorum of their members in December of 2009. So I believe at that time they had 3 members. So there have been issues as far as having a complete committee. And now in April, they at least have a quorum of the members. And there were indications from the treasurer, the controller, and BT&H that they were going to select the
And
additional-
will those peer review committee, will they be making on a set time frame recommendations regarding the financing plan and the business plan as they were supposed to be doing?
That, I'm not aware of that. They are supposed to look at the authority's plans in general. They are supposed to look at funding plans for the various corridors specifically.
Well, that's what you're asking for,
That's-
that which you said we don't see at all in.
And that's a somewhat different issue. This was the financial plan for the entire program. The law also speaks about funding plans for corridors.
Right.
And when those are financed.
But you also indicated that you have real concerns that we're not really looking at those corridors, that there may not be even funding right now for one of those 6 corridors, let alone saying that all 6. And so that we need some input in terms of the adequacy of the funding for those corridors. Is the authority going to be, they will be making some decisions in terms of where they spend the money, and it's supposed to be reviewed, and then those recommendations coming back to the legislature. And what we're hearing is that process is just now beginning to get set up. What I'm saying is I want to know real clearly what that peer review committee is going to be doing and when they will be making recommendations also. I think it's critical for us to have that data too.
Right. One of the suggestions, Senator, as Jim indicated, they now have 5 members. And when I actually spoke with someone at the Treasurer's office, and they were actively trying to identify, the Treasurer, the Controller, and BT&H, those 3 additional individuals. But they have enough to establish a quorum now where that body could meet. And one of the suggestions may be is to have the authority establish a timeline or a plan for this peer review group to look at each of their financial plans for each of the corridors and report that back to the legislature. So you could set up certain milestones and say, we would like the peer review group to look at the business or the financial plans for these 3 corridors or for all 6 corridors by a certain date. That's one suggestion.
Through the chair, and I should know this and I forgot, the qualifications for the 3 remaining individuals are what?
It's in here, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I don't know that one off the top of my head. We actually have, I think, a text box in the report itself that talks about what the qualifications of the individuals. See if I can find it quickly. Do you have it? Okay.
And I've got my copy of the report.
If you have the report, if you go to page 26 in the audit report,
Got it.
You'll see a text box in the left-hand column, and it indicates what types of experience and who for example, the first bullet is 2 with the experience in construction designated by the State Treasurer's Office. So it lays out for you each of the individuals, who the appointing authority is, and what they're looking for.
So if we have some qualified talent in our districts, this might be the time to point them towards these individuals. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just ask one other follow-up on something and then ask Senator Huff or Senator Pavley if they have any questions also before we move on. The one other question I have really, I think, is just outside of it is not really covered by the audit, but it was something that Senator Simitian touched on. What we have been hearing very much, what if I might summarize, besides the real concerns that we've had about the business plan and the financing plan, and that led to really requesting help from the state auditor. The other issue that we commonly hear, and I'm not sure that you can really even answer this, is the concerns of that there's not the decision-making process that the authority engages in seems to be one in which the community, in terms of community engagement, perceives as a top-down model. That is, decisions are made, they go into communities, and what we end up hearing is people up in arms. That's all we hear. We hear either it's from the Anaheim to LA, all those cities, or the peninsula, all those cities feeling that they're not listened to. In any way, did you hear any of that at all in this, or was that really beyond the scope? Because that is something that really is the other issue that we have heard, and that is that somehow the project manager, which was supposed to manage also the communication between the authority and the communities, is perceived out there anyway, the project manager, as telling people what they're going to get or not get, whether it's true or not. We just hear that all the time. And so we're wondering whether you heard some of those same concerns at all.
No.
Okay. Senator Huff.
Thank you. A few other questions. When you were sampling those 22 invoices, did you use some generally accepted accounting principles or I don't know if the government has similar type of principles, but did you follow some standard on what percentage of invoices that you took a look at?
We looked at the dollar values that were paid to the various subcontractors during that 3-year period, and we allocated our test items according to the dollars that had been paid to the various contractors. So that was pretty much the basis.
So it represented a percentage of the value paid?
Right.
What percentage would that be?
The total amount paid, it was in the low 20%.
Okay. As far as a quantity of invoices, any idea what percentage that was? How many total invoices versus the 22 you looked at?
It was a lower percentage. It was probably more in the low teens.
Okay.
In that area. So we did focus on higher value invoices.
Okay. How many of those were from the program manager, do you recall?
We had 8.
8 from the program manager for theirs,
right.
Out of the 22?
No, 8
they're
out of
separate.
Total.
We had 30 total.
We looked at 30 invoices total. 22 were the regional contractors,
got you.
and then 8 invoices were for the program manager.
Okay, for the program manager, just for a moment, then we'll go back to the others. Was there a protocol in place for approving those?
There is a protocol in place as far as a person who is assigned to approve those. As far as that person doing much in regards to checking whether deliverables have been provided, that wasn't there.
So there was a protocol, but it wasn't followed consistently anyway on the
Right.
for the program manager's invoices.
Right. There just isn't really much there at all, except someone will look at the invoice and check it for its accuracy as far as that the total is correct, that kind of thing. That does happen, but as far as whether the deliverable was received related to that invoice, that's not checked.
Okay, so more of a bookkeeping as opposed to it is an appropriate invoice for.
Right.
Yeah, okay. And on the other 22, then, it's been characterized that there was no documentation. Is that an accurate description?
No, that is not an accurate description. There is documentation as far as direct costs that are charged, as far as time that was spent by individual employees of the contractor. That kind of information is there. But as far as documentation on someone checking to make sure that they were satisfied that the authority had received what it contracted for, that is not there.
Right. So that's similar to what the program manager, what they didn't do work, it was just there's nobody signing off to do the work they were contracted to do. And on the 22 invoices, what it was lacking was that program manager's signature saying that this is what they were supposed to do. So there's detail, it just wasn't signed off that it was actually what it was they were supposed to be doing. Okay. And then you said there were some that were outside of the contract that wasn't even included. How many did that represent? Do you recall?
Well, it was, I don't know exactly.
Okay.
We did put the dollar value that we found as far as that was outside of the contract. So we said 268. 268 million, or 1,000, sorry.
Just got my hair up.
So, yeah.
No, 268,000.
It was a relatively small part, but we were concerned that they would even be paid for something where they didn't have an agreement about what was
That
going
included
to be
the furniture for the program manager, or was that a separate?
That was a separate issue.
Okay. All right. Well, that helps put some context into it then. You mentioned that a standard response according to your typical audit is 60 days where now is that just they respond back on a progress report basically? Here are our findings we did, what have you done? And then it's 6 months, and then it's 1 year, correct?
Right, that's our standard practice, but we have the ability to modify that if the committee desires. Yeah.
My question for you is, in your professional experience, do you think that's adequate for this situation?
Well, for this situation, because of the high risk and the importance of this, we may need to have them respond more frequently. The other thing that my office can and does do on particular audits that are a high-risk particular situation. For example, some of the Recovery Act work that we've done, we've had some significant concerns. We intend to go back into those agencies within the next few weeks to see where they're at related to audits we issued just 2-3 months ago at the most. So we could do the same thing here. We could go back into the authority within 60 days and say, this control is now being exercised as far as making sure that these invoices are being paid after written assurance that the deliverables are there and the work's being done. So we could certainly do that. We could certainly, as I indicated, ask for a response from the authority every couple of months, every 60 days, rather than waiting another 4 months after we get the 60-day response, waiting for that 6-month response. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I just have a few more questions, but just to follow up on that, I was looking here, this goes back to almost the original question I asked. It said out of the report, you say the authority paid contractors more than $268,000 for services performed outside of the contractor's work plans and purchased the $46,000 in furniture for one of its contractors' use based upon an oral agreement contradicted by a later written contract. Right. Should they be getting this money back?
Well, I think the difficulty is they, based on an oral agreement, or some of these outside the scope, they ask these contractors to do this type of work. If the contractor provided that type of work, I don't know how much. And again, I'm not an attorney. I don't know how much ability the authority would have in saying, we asked you to do something outside the scope of work. We paid you. We want the money back because it wasn't in the scope. I think the authority needs to be much more cautious. If they're going to ask them to do something additional, as Senator Ashburn has indicated, then modify the contract. If you feel like you need additional things done by this particular contractor, then let's get a modification as opposed to just asking them to do something that's not within the scope.
Thank you. And the last comment, you brought up also on this that the authority's plans for private financing include a revenue guarantee that needs further specification, but it is working to improve its approach to risk management. And later on, you say that the authority's financial planning consultant has addressed concerns raised by the LAO's office that this might be a prohibited operating subsidy. However, details are lacking. One of the things that this committee is very concerned about has been that we follow the law, and that it was real clear in the bond that there would not be any operating subsidy paid by the state. Do you see some conflict here between this concept of a revenue guarantee and the prohibition on operating subsidy? Because you mentioned, well, if in fact they make additional sums of money, if they're above their projections, that's one issue. But if they're below, that's when you need a revenue guarantee. That seems to me awfully close to an operating subsidy.
Well, on its face, it certainly raises concern. I wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't be comfortable, Senator, opining on whether or not that's appropriate or not. We certainly raised it as something that's been a concern. I think LAO raised it as a concern in their report.
And we're raising it also. We're not saying that.
We need to get an answer on that.
We just need to understand that better as a committee, not saying.
I would agree.
We just need to know really what they're talking about in terms of a revenue guarantee.
Right, and I would agree, and I think that's something that's, again, needs to be resolved relatively soon if that's in the event there is not an operating surplus and private investors are expecting a revenue guarantee. We need to know the determination whether that's okay and whether or not it's appropriate with respect to the provisions in Proposition 1A. Know the answer to that question, because if that's going to be a key provision in private investors being willing to participate, we need to know the answer to that question.
Thank you. And I'm not, again, I think you were real clear in the fact that there's a potential that the authority could be burning through both the $900 million that they've set aside for planning, pre-construction costs, and the money, I think it's 200 and some odd million for administrative costs. I think, again, to reiterate and to reinforce what you've said, and then maybe you can ask, it's really important that we get a clear understanding, or you get a clear understanding, can get back to us and further, just how much money has been spent and how much has not, and what's really left. It'd be terrible to spend that money and then find out that we have to now come back and use additional monies to pay for that because they've already spent it because no one was keeping track of just how much money. So I would encourage you, as you follow through, to make sure that we get a clearer picture of just what's been spent for both pre-construction costs and administrative costs, as you've indicated in the report, that you're just unclear what's happened. But you didn't indicate when we would know that data, just that they don't yet. I would hope that that data would be forthcoming. Not hearing anything now after this great introduction, let's hear from the High Speed Rail Authority and see what they have to say. Welcome.
You can sit closer. We still can't reach you.
I wasn't sure if they were staying or going.
I see that.
Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Porvahidi, Interim Executive Director to the High Speed Rail Authority, and with me is Jeff Barker. He's the Deputy Director of Communications. Dear Committee Chairman Lowenthal and committee members, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to comment on the Bureau's audit of the high-speed train program. This is a historic project for California, which has the potential to bring tens of thousands of jobs to the state in the near term and bring improved mobility, increased economic strength, and environmental benefits in the long term. The authority is committed to transparency and believes strongly that additional spotlights on our operations through this audit will ultimately make for a better high-speed train project for the state. So the authority appreciates the input and recommendations from the Bureau of State Audits and agrees with its findings. We believe the audit process has identified areas where the authority can improve its administrative processes and project oversight. The audit report correctly describes the enormity and complexity of the high-speed train project. It also correctly describes the organizational structure of the authority and the recent budget changes that have occurred to supplement staffing. It's important to note that staffing levels have been a concern of the authority board for some time and has taken significant actions to address this issue. The authority is committed to building a high-speed train system in a responsible way that reflects the will of the people of the state, and in that task, we are grateful for additional oversight of entities such as the Bureau of State Audits. I appreciate the comments provided by Chairman Lowenthal, Senators Huff and Simitian on the high-speed rail project. The authority looks forward to our continued partnership with the legislature in bringing high-speed trains to fruition in California. Addressing directly the recommendations of the auditor, in response to the publishing funding scenarios, the authority agrees and recognizes your concerns over the financing of this project. It will take a joint effort by the authority, the administration, the legislature, and our California delegation to push for federal appropriations for high-speed trains in California and the nation. The authority has been working with the California delegation to ensure that there is substantial commitment in the Federal Transportation Reauthorization Act for national high-speed train programs in which the California project is well positioned to benefit from. The authority agrees that it is important to be aware and plan for funding scenarios that differ from the scenario we have presented in our December 2009 business plan. It is important to note that alternate scenarios will not vary in terms of ratio of state to federal to private funding. Instead, alternate scenarios will be presented as lengthened timelines for the construction and for bringing online revenue-based passenger service, which in turn would mean an increased project cost as inflation affects the cost of materials and labor. In regards to the recommendation, the authority should further specify potential cost revenue guarantees and who would pay for them. The authority is very clear, and the law is very clear, that California high-speed train system will operate without a subsidy. Therefore, the authority will be investigating a variety of funding scenarios. The authority's new CEO has experience with development of financing packages on a variety of projects. His background will help in the directing and developing of funding plans. Additionally, the authority has determined a need for hiring a financial team with experience in structuring large financing packages and will be issuing an RFP in the coming months for these services. The authority agrees that as we move from the environmental planning phase into the implementation phase, it will be important to further detail the concept of a minimum revenue guarantee, its costs, and the entity we would propose to be responsible for such a guarantee. The authority has already asked its financial consultant, currently on board, to address these issues within the context of the overall proposed procurement and risk transfer strategy, which is scheduled to commence with the request for qualifications process later this year and request for proposals in process in 2011. Additionally, we have been working with legal counsel on this issue and will ask for written opinion on this matter. Finally, AB 3034 requires the development of and submittal of a financing plan to the legislature for prior approval to expending any of Proposition 1A funds on capital construction. This is an opportunity for the legislature to thoroughly review and comment on the plan before appropriating any funds for the project. Responding to the recommendation regarding the authority should assure that it implements planned actions related to risk management. The authority agrees that risk management is a top priority. The authority has developed a risk register which was attached to the 2009 business plan addendum. The risk register is the protocol and process for assessing, managing risk, which the authority will be employing and improving throughout the project. Additionally, the KPMG organizational assessment has identified the position of a project controls and risk management position with the direct report to the CEO and the establishment of an audit office, which is an element of the 2010 and 11 annual budget. In February 2010, the authority hired a risk insurance manager to provide a variety of expert services directed at reducing the authority's exposure to project liabilities. The risk insurance manager will assess the high-speed rail program and the authority's plans for developing the system, then make preliminary recommendations for approaches to managing liability through an insurance program. In response to the recommendation, the authority should ensure that the peer review group adheres to the Meeting Act and seek formal opinion from the Office of the Attorney General regarding whether the peer review group is subject to this act. The report correctly states that the authority has received legal advice suggesting that the independent peer review committee is not intended to be set up as a public entity operating within the structure of the required by the Bagley-Keene Act. But we agree that this topic merits clarity. To that end, the authority will continue to work on this issue with legal counsel, the Deputy Attorney General from the Office of the Attorney General's Office. Additionally, the authority will approach the legislature and the Bureau of State Audits questions pertaining to intent, and in that independent review is legislative created entity. The authority welcomes working with the peer review group, respects its independence, and looks forward to advice it may ultimately provide. Though the appointing entities have yet to make full eight appointments to the committee, the authority has already engaged the existing appointees on a number of issues, including the most recent business plan report to the legislature and the KPMG organizational assessment report. We have also communicated directly with the three appointing bodies regarding their vacant positions and suggesting that those positions be filled. In relation to the recommendation, the authority should track expenditures for activities and develop a long-term spending plan. The authority thanks the Bureau of State Audits for this recommendation to develop a long-term spending plan for pre-construction activities and will do so. The authority has already begun to bring online a database for tracking expenditures, which will include detailed provisions for monitoring expenditures by source and mechanisms to alert staff of potential problems. This database is scheduled to be in place by the end of May 2010. Regarding the Recovery Act, the authority has already reached out and began work in cooperation with the Governor's Recovery Act Task Force and will review all Recovery Act requirements and implement procedures to track compliance. The authority has sent a letter to the Office of the Inspector General requesting a pre-audit of the authority that will help in the preparation for the receipt of the funds. Also getting a consultation from the Office of Inspector General in putting together controls. And finally, feedback on the action plan we will produce as part of our 60-day follow-up to the Bureau of State Audits once we have produced it. On the note of the database, we do recognize that, yes, we have not been monitoring the aspect of the percentages needed or required within AB 3034. We will be able to go back and identify all expenditures since bond funds have been appropriated in 9-10 and 8-9 and be able to segregate them between administrative costs as well as program costs. Regarding the recommendation, we should amend the program management oversight consultant's work plan to include critical review of progress reports, and the authority staff should also ensure that the program manager revises its progress reports. We agree that a critical review of the program manager's monthly progress reports should be included within the program management consultant's contract. We do believe that it was incorporated, maybe not explicitly in the contract, but implicitly in the materials that they are to provide oversight on. We will make every effort to incorporate that term within their contract. Additionally, there have been 3 public hearings of the Operations Committee of the Board. They have reviewed thoroughly the program manager's progress reports, which have also been audited by the Program Management Oversight Team. They have been updated. They now are much more readable, much more understandable by the general public, our board members, as well as staff. Regarding the recommendation, the authority should participate in the development of key policy documents, such as the authority's business plan and strategic plan. The authority strongly agrees and appreciates with the Bureau of State Audit's recognition in its report that the authority's increased participation in the project's development and details over the past months. The report notes the board members were involved in the development of the strategic plan and the business plan, but that involvement has has already increased. The board executive administrative committee has been giving significant input into the strategic plan at the April 7th board meeting. We were instructed to make some changes to the strategic plan. Those changes were made and was brought back to the executive admin committee at the May board meeting and was approved by the entire board last week. In light of the audit report, the board has been re-advised on its approval methods for communicating with contractors, which is one of the subjects of the revision in addition to the authority's board and policies procedures, which was discussed on April 7th at our board meeting and was approved at our May board meeting. The recommendation should ensure that staff adhere to controls for processing invoices and should not pay invoices from regional contractors. The authority thanks the Bureau of State Audits for identifying this weakness in our protocols. While this verification and notification has indeed been occurring, it has often been informal or verbal. And though no improprieties have occurred as a result of the current process, the authority agrees that the process must be improved and by being documented in writing. The authority is developing standard forms and procedures to formalize this process to ensure the verification and notification is made routinely in writing and easily documented in the contracts and invoices. I just want to point out that after the audit, I requested that the program manager go back and look at their records as far as reviewing the regional contractors' invoices based on their preliminary audit. I've been assured since 2008, the majority of those regional contracts have been reviewed. The invoices have been reviewed on a monthly basis. They have written documentation. That documentation had not been transmitted to the authority.
Has it now been transmitted?
I just found out that information today, and I've requested that information be forwarded.
But it hasn't been.
Not yet. The authority should adhere to the conditions of the contracts and work plans and make amendments or modifications to work plans in writing. The authority agrees with the review that all contracts and work plans to identify any that require modifications or amendments. Additionally, it should be noted that in January 2010, the authority brought aboard a state employee assigned for contract manager to the authority's regional engineering consultants with the responsibility to audit, oversee, and correct instances such as those described in the report. And the final recommendation of the authority should ensure written policies and procedures reflect intended controls over invoice processing. The authority will review our contract administration manual and will identify areas such as controls over invoice processing to make certain that policies and procedures are adequately detailed in a manner that ensures effective controls are in place. For deficient or missing policies, staff will prepare them and communicate them to staff responsible for the invoice payments.
Thank you. It seems, well, thank you for that report. It seems like the operative word is you agree with the auditor's report. I'm still not convinced that the concept of agreeing with it really means that you will bring about the changes that they've seen. Only time will tell. My first question is, you keep talking about the authority. Has the authority, the board, have they ever approved the business plan formally?
They approved the addendum that was submitted. I don't know.
I'm talking about the business plan that we received in December. Has it ever been voted on? Can you tell me whether that was agendized and voted on by the authority?
Yeah, the addendum that we brought back.
Not the addendum. I'm talking about
the item in which we brought back the addendum was inclusive of the original business plan. The original business plan was reviewed by the board, inclusive of that item.
There was a vote on this? What do you say?
There was a vote to approve the business plan as revised with the addendum. Yes.
When was that?
That was, I apologize, April board meeting.
So the December business plan that you submitted to us was voted on by the board when we requested that there be a business plan in place in order to receive the funding. That was voted on by the board?
In December, no, it was not.
It was not. I think that's some of the issues that when we talk about the authority, we're not sure who really speaks for the authority, whether they've ever voted on these issues. The other question is to talk about, and you've heard some of the recommendations of the auditor, which you agreed upon, about developing some of the inadequacies and the need for a robust financial plan based upon different levels of funding. Can we expect to see what the auditor is asking for, that a business plan that includes levels of funding for the different corridors, and what might be different scenarios if there is not full funding? What will occur? What will be funded? Where there are shortfalls, Can we expect to see that? And when?
We currently have a financial advisor on board who is working on putting together funding packages for each of the corridors. It's a scenario. It's not something that we can guarantee that we're going to have this much federal funds, we're going to have this much private sector funds.
That's why we want to see the different options.
We just want to have different scenarios, yes.
Right. And when would we anticipate seeing that?
It really depends on the information they're going to be able to garner from the regional contractors and what's happening in the regional corridors. I can't give you a specific time as to when those numbers will be available.
But you know that that's
It's in there.
identified by the auditor as one of the key recommendations.
Yes.
That for us to see specifically what might be funded, what might not be funded, what that time frame is, what the priorities are, we have no idea, given the business plan and the financial plan contained within it, really what might or might not occur. We just have this general phase one will occur, $42 billion or whatever, but we have no idea now with any of the specifics of what will happen, where that, what are different scenarios, what if the federal funding does not occur that by 2012 or 2013, or are you also anticipating additional state funding? You've never really indicated that or not. We just would like more light shed on that, as the auditor has said, because we are in the dark about that. The next question gets back to the more specifics that we've asked also. The program manager has already, and now you're saying that there is some documentation going back. Will you be able to assure this committee that all of the work was completed in the payment of all the invoices that were paid, not just the 20 that the auditor has now said were incomplete? A lot of money was paid out with incomplete documentation. When will we know specifically whether, in fact, there is that documentation, that written documentation?
Well, hopefully within the 60 days, I'll be able to compile that information from the program manager and provide that as a response to the Bureau of State Audits.
What's your overall evaluation of the effectiveness and the work of the program manager?
I think they're doing a great job. It's charting new ground for California and the nation in building a high-speed train project.
You think they've done great work in paying all these bills without any documentation?
Well, I was looking more at what they're doing at a programmatic level as far as managing and moving this project forward, getting the environmental work done, getting the engineering work done.
How about their
oversight of the...
How about their communications with the communities?
Well, as you know, that was an issue that we addressed last year by pulling out the communications aspect of their work and bringing it directly into the authority with a direct report to the authority. We felt that there was some missteps that occurred, and therefore we pulled it out and have now a consultant that reports directly to our our Director of Communications.
If in fact you are not satisfied, or the auditor is not satisfied within the next 60 days that you can really provide the program manager all the documentation, do you think further action needs to be taken? Can we recoup some of these costs?
I believe that we paid for work that was done. I mean, it wasn't work that was not done. It was just a misstep. It was a misstep in one of the processes and getting confirmation from the program manager. But as far as the work that was done at the regional level, work was done. We have deliverables that were received from the regional contractors.
Senator Smithian.
I want to circle back to the question I asked earlier of the auditor, and that I think you indirectly raised just a moment ago, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Porvahidi, you were here, you heard the question. business plan issues, finance plan issues, community engagement issues, legality of the guarantee that's been described, peer review issues. What's a reasonable time to have all those issues squared away?
Well, with our new CEO coming on board on June 1st, it will be up to him as to what time frame they'll be able to.
No, I'm sorry, ma'am. Nice try. You've heard from constituents. You've heard from the Budget Subcommittee. You've heard from the Transportation Policy Committee. You've heard from the Legislative Analyst's Office. And you've heard from the Auditor. These issues are not new. To your credit, you've acknowledged the need for improvement in a number of these areas. Question is, at what point should we throw up our hands and say, we give up, it's not going to happen? Which I can't speak for others. I certainly don't want that day to come, but at some point, I'm going to have a hard time believing it's going to get better. So, the auditor indicated January 15th was not an unreasonable expectation. It's going to be very hard. At that point, we'll be 2 years beyond the passage of the bond. It's going to be very hard to say, sure, we should keep investing hundreds of millions of dollars, looking towards billions of dollars, if these issues have not been addressed. So my question to you here today, quite purposefully on the record, is that a reasonable expectation, January the 15th? And if you don't want to answer the question today, then can you have somebody from your operation commit to get back to us within 2 weeks as to a date certain by which these issues will be fully and satisfactorily resolved?
Yes, we will get back to you in 2 weeks.
If that's your preference, I'm prepared to acknowledge there's a new sheriff in town. But I'm looking then, Mr. Chairman, based on the commitment that's just been made, to hear back in 2 weeks as to whether and by what date it is reasonable for us to expect these issues to be resolved. Again, they are business plan, financial plan, community engagement, revenue guarantee, and peer review issues that have been raised in this hearing and in previous hearings. And at some point, as I say, I think people are going to say, we can't do it. We have managed thus far, Mr. Chairman, in the budget process to essentially say we're going to appropriate the funds or authorize the appropriation of the funds based on certain preconditions, and that if those conditions are met, we'll move forward. I anticipate that we'll be having a similar conversation sometime in the next few weeks in the Budget Subcommittee process. But at some point, I think people are going to say, do we just have to call it a day and toss it in? And I hope that day never comes, but that's the question. And then just one further comment I will raise with respect to the community engagement issue. Because the community has struggled so much in my area to get answers to questions, they call our office. And then that means we call you. And I think we've got 2 out of 3 areas where that's working reasonably well. If we call the Sacramento office directly and speak to your staff, we usually can make a connection, have that work. If we call the local contractors and the folks who are your partners at the local level, that usually works. But if there is a question, often on behalf of a constituent, some interested party, that has to go up the rungs from the local folks to Sacramento, back down to the local folks so that they can answer it for us, that isn't working. Hasn't been working, isn't working. And given the fact that you've got new help on board for communications purposes, that's a cause for concern. We need, in a perfect world, our offices wouldn't be in the position of having to field these calls, but they are. It's part of our job description. If folks can't work with state agencies without an intermediary, then we have to step in and be that intermediary. But right now, we're having trouble getting questions answered. If they go up the chain and back down the chain, we're not getting a timely response. Thank you. And I apologize. I'm going to have to step out at 3:30, Mr. Chairman, but thank you.
Just before, I'd like to kind of make one observation following up Senator Simitian's comments and wishing for a real clear answer and sense of frustration that, we began to hold hearings on the inadequacy or really on the business plan in December of 2007. and actually had to put it into AB 3034 to require that we have a business plan, because we never got that business plan. Before the election, it came I think it came really 3 days after the election, which is not what the legislature asked for. And then only through the budget process, by holding funds, were we able to even get that done in December. I think that's a poor way of doing policy, to kind of constantly leverage it. But I will tell you, if that's the only way to do it, we will continue to do that. We need this information. Senator Huff.
You made a comment that you felt the program manager's doing a great job. I think part of our frustration is that your program manager is an excellent company. They certainly have a lot of business. They're one of the few that have the capability of handling a project this size. The frustration is that, yes, it's the first of its kind, but putting in a systems of control for work completed, for knowing that it's been done and signing off and paying checks is very fundamental to even the smallest business person. So that part's frustrating because that's not new, and yet that's what they were sort of hired to oversee this. And that's where our frustration emanates from. I think you will find us a lot less of a pain in the neck, once you get your systems down and following the procedures, and it becomes more routine. And I recognize startups just have built-in problems, but hopefully, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, here in this one. A couple of quick questions. You mentioned on the alternative funding scenarios that I think your exact quote was, would not vary in terms of the ratio of state to federal to private funding. It would just lengthen the time and therefore the cost of the project. So you're expecting that what we will do is, when we eventually get enough federal funding that we match with our state funding, you have a fixed amount for each of those, right? The ratio. Okay. But as it gets more expensive, the fare box recovery is going to be more expensive also, unless you're just planning on running it another 100 years to recover the cost. So I guess the real thing we're looking for is, is there a conservative scenario, a more realistic scenario, and a worst case scenario kind of a thing that we can look at, so that we get some idea of what are we looking at here? Because I think right now you've taken an aggressive, high ridership model and based that in, we would just like to know more, okay, it may happen, it may not happen, but if it doesn't happen, what are we looking at, so we can just kind of understand the parameters a little bit better. And with that, I will stipulate that when President Eisenhower, envisioned the freeway system, I don't think he knew what the cost was or what was involved. In fact, he was thinking of it for military purposes, and including, straight stretches to land airplanes on. But it served something totally different. We couldn't have the commerce that we have without that grid in place, so it was a strategic asset for the nation. I similarly see, although without the military connection, the high-speed rail as a fundamental infrastructure for the state, not for now as much as we'd like it now, but for the future as our state continues to grow. And so I see this as something that has to happen. And we may be a little ahead of the curve. I hope not. But my hope and expectation is that we can wrestle all these issues to the ground, get our arms on it, and then move forward and, make this thing happen in a way that's affordable. So anyway, I appreciate you coming and responding. That's really all I had. I think you answered the other one I had.
Thank you. And thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering if there are members of the public that would like to address the committee.
Mr. Chair, members, Jay Hansen with the State Building Construction Trades Council. First off, I just have to say I'm surprised that it seems like such an adversarial process that this committee continues to have with the High-Speed Rail Authority. When I look at the questions that were asked of the Bureau of State Audits, I see, has the High-Speed Rail Authority established a structure to administer and manage the billions of dollars in proceeds authorized by the voters? in a process that is transparent, provides for accountability, and ensures the cost-effective use of public resources. That should have an addendum that says with 9 people. Every one of these questions should say with 9 people. How does the High-Speed Rail Authority manage and monitor its contracts with 9 people? Well, it can't do the things it needs to do unless it has the staff to be able to do that. The members of this committee have more staff answering constituent mail than the High-Speed Rail Authority
I believe they
has.
spent $200 million on a project manager.
And that's the worst place to spend the money.
But
the
they
money
did.
should be spent to buy. We should have hired staff to do that, and the legislature and the governor's office have not allowed them to do that. So we get what we deserve, and it's not proper. And especially being someone from labor, why aren't we providing? If we want to provide good jobs, it should be good staff jobs. Those people are going to be there for a long time. And I look at some of the notes here, and I'm shocked that government and state agencies would actually plan on getting money from the federal government to complete a budget. I've never seen that before, except in the budget of the legislature. Yet that's something that is a negative when the High-Speed Rail Authority does that. It's there's a big group of us of labor, our congressional delegation, congressional leadership, the Labor Federation. We went to Washington, D.C. to go lobby to try to get as much money as we could from the federal government, because there's a lot of people that are doing this now. We got the biggest appropriation in the entire nation, went to California. We didn't get it for a race to the top and all the other different federal grants, but on this, we got the #1 in the entire nation. Why? Because the U.S. Department of Transportation, President Obama, Vice President Biden, who's personally spearheading this, said California is so far ahead of everybody else, they can have a flagship system there. The difference of California and what's happening in the rest of the states that got some of that money, the other states are working cooperatively with their high-speed rail systems. California, some people in the legislature seem to be doing everything they can to undermine this and to make it a failure so that we have to give the money back and we're gone. I think what Senator Simitian said was, I wish he was here so I could ask him. He said that at some point the clock's going to run out and they just have to throw up your hands. Well, I think some people would like that to happen. And I think, personally, I wonder if that's what he would like to happen. We should have the legislature working cooperatively with the High-Speed Rail Authority. You should send your staff. You should have Mr. Bauer join them. You should have people helping them out and help them be successful. I'm asking, please try to help them be successful and not have such an adversarial relationship. It just seems like it's all based on gotcha and looking for the problems. Well, guess what? If you give a company with no authority, no oversight, little oversight from a 9-member board and some people who are appointed, you're going to have all sorts of, skullduggery that happens with the money. If you have people who are staff that are accountable to you and to the governor and to the people, at the board, that's how you're going to get accountability. You hire contractors accounted for 95% of the program's expenditures. That's outrageous. Why was that money spent on staff? We know that we're building a system for eternity. We should have people that are on staff doing that, and it just seems like we're setting this up for failure. And on behalf of the building trades, we want to put some of our members to work. This is a great jobs bill. It's something that California should do. This government, we're planning on for being here for eternity. Let's build a system that's going to serve the people. The state is only going to continue to grow. And I'm mystified that it just seems so adversarial and that we're not working together to try to make this successful. And I hope that we move in that direction.
Patrick Hanning on behalf of the California State Council of Laborers. We share a lot of the similar concerns as Mr. Hansen. We have sold this to our members, and I think that this program has been sold to the voters as something that we can look towards, something that will be part of our future. Our workers are suffering 35% unemployment, and see this as a project that will hopefully help sustain them, sustain their health care, sustain their pensions into the future. And we need to be able to march hand in hand together. When we, again, as Mr. Hansen said, went to Washington to fight for some of these federal dollars, we did it with our legislative leadership, or at least what we thought was us all marching hand in hand to try to get these federal funds. And when we come back here, it seems more adversarial instead of trying to help them along. We start to hear what it sounds like to me as ultimatums instead of, we need to get you to a point where we can work together to make sure we see this project commence. The voters have said that they want to see this project. They've committed billions of dollars and have committed us to this. And instead of trying to put barriers in front of it. We'd rather see us create a staff that'll take us through the future. I happen to also sit on the Proposition 63 Commission, the tax on millionaires that goes towards mental health, and have seen firsthand some of the struggles and when you don't have the staff around you that can be able to respond to the legislature, which is a huge part of actually what every commission does. And on top of that, be able to respond and put forth the types of programs that are necessary to build this. I mean, to be able to achieve the federal funds, to be able to get those, we need to be able to be as forward-thinking and as helpful as we possibly can to try to get this thing off the ground. It is frankly struggling, and we see that. And we're as frustrated as we can hear from your voices. But instead of that frustration, we need to keep our eye on the prize, because we do believe that this is part of a system that will sustain our state and help solve some of the transportation issues, as we have sat down, frankly, Mr. Chairman, with your office and talked a lot about, particularly when we start talking about cuts to transit and other things. We're hopeful that this takes away some of that burden to some of the localities as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Other witnesses?
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tina Angelina with the Planning and Conservation League, and I want to thank you first for initiating the audit and then for having this hearing today. As many of you know, over the past maybe 18 to 20 months now, our organization, along with the other organizations that we work throughout the state, have been raising concerns about this project, not because we're anti-high-speed rail. In fact, the Planning and Conservation League has been pushing for high-speed rail for a decade now, but because our greatest fear was that this project would turn into a boondoggle. We'd spend $10 billion and we'd not have a train. And a bunch of pieces of track are not good enough. That's not high-speed rail. That's not what the voters approved. So we've been watching this project very carefully and coming to all of you with the concerns that we've seen. Now, we've seen through the LAO's report and now the state auditor's report that those concerns are indeed real, and we need to think fast and act fast to steer this ship into the direction that will actually give us the train that the voters asked for and authorized. Listening to the questions here today and the responses, it occurs to me that as these problems have been brought up, the authority has said, well, we can address that. When they've admitted there's a problem, they've said we can address that and we'll put systems in place. And now we're hearing that they're not even following the systems they've put in place. I urge you not to be okay with simply more systems put in place to review contracts or to look at what they're doing, or more weekly reports. You asked for a business plan. This body was very deliberate in crafting Proposition 1A and said you need to have a business plan in place before we get going on this project, so we've got some certainty. Well, that business plan wasn't good. Then you said, okay, well, we're not going to give you all of your funding until you get us the right business plan. Well, they came forward with yet another faulty business plan. They got their funding because we don't want to shut the doors on the project. And then they had to give you another amendment to a business plan, which still doesn't address the ridership questions, the risk questions. We can draw this out for more months and more years, but until we take a serious break from this and look at the course we're steering and figure out how we can fix this problem, we're not going to address these solutions. So I urge you to, instead of just saying, okay, let's put new systems in place, no, let's really figure out how we can get this train built. And we've got some ideas, and we'll bring them to the Budget Committee. First and foremost among those is we need to get the company that's going to be operating this train at the table now, because they will have a vested interest in getting this train built. I look forward to the discussion going forward on how we can fix these problems, and we really, really applaud you guys for taking this seriously. We want this train for the environment. We want it for the jobs. We want it for the state, but I really fear that we're not going to get it unless we take some quick action. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and other members of the committee. My name is Shahram Shirazi. I'm a private investor and a concerned citizen. I'm a resident of Atherton. I've been in Atherton for 18 years. My background, I have 3 degrees from MIT. I have a Stanford MBA, class of 1980. I'm currently the CEO of an internet startup, and I've been the CEO and chairman of various companies for the past 15 years. I've also served on boards of directors. I've taken part in leveraged buyouts. I've taken part in initial public offerings, equity financing, and debt financing of many different companies. I understand and intimately am familiar with financial statements. I'm representing myself as a private investor, and I also speak for a number of my friends who also could be potential private investors with fairly substantial sums of money to be invested, if indeed it's a good investment. I have to tell you the following. I've read the business plan. There's a complete lack of transparency in the business plan. It does not really even come to the level of a simple investment-grade business plan. This is problematic. The business plan makes no financial sense for the following reasons. First, on the revenue side, the ridership numbers, in my opinion, are grossly overstated, and also, when you look at them in detail, it does not look like they're based on statistical analysis of other ridership numbers for other types of high-speed rail trains in other parts of the world. In terms of the cost side of the equation, I have to mention the following things. First of all, going back to the lack of transparency, when I look at the business plan, I'm trying to put it politely, I see a shell game going on with the issue of cost. There are a lot of acronyms in there that are meant to perhaps hide cost center. I wish I could do that with my household. If I could lump my mortgage payment with my PG&E bill and call it cost of living, it doesn't make any difference. At the end of the day, I still have to write the checks to those entities and pay those entities. So please do not fall for the shell game of acronyms in the cost plan, because it really doesn't mean anything to me. I have one simple saying for anyone who comes to me and wants to invest with me or ask for my investment advice. The cost is the cost is the cost. You can't get rid of it. And it has to be there. The other issue on the cost side is I don't see a reference to the cost of capital. Capital is not free. Capital has costs. Whether it's equity capital or debt capital, it has a cost. If it's equity financing, S&P is doing 12% over time. I require at least 16% for deals that I invest on an equity side, and on the debt side, again, you're competing, or the authority will be competing with various other entities who are going out for debt. I agree with much of what the state auditor has said, if not all of it, actually. After having heard her say all that, at this point, unless I see a business plan that makes sense, I, for one, and I'm just one with my friends and associates, will not invest in this project because it's not really an investment project for us. It just does not hold water, and as we say in my industry, it doesn't pass the smell test. Just a couple of final notes. In terms of contracting, a very simple thing that a contract should include is a statement of work, deliverables, timelines for those deliverables, acceptance criteria, invoice payment schedules, and breach, remedies for breach, and cure for that breach. These are very simple issues that should be in a contract. And if indeed the High-Speed Rail Authority can sit here and say, we have to get back to you in 60 days on what the contract is saying, I don't think that's, again, an investment-grade issue that I'd like to be involved with. I thank you for your time. I'm happy to address any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Other witnesses in
hello, Senators. Russ Peterson, with representing the Community Coalition on High-Speed Rail. I've been to several of these meetings, not all 7, as you, Senator Lowenthal. But we have a growing membership, and we even have folks, although some people think we're against high-speed rail, we have folks from the Californians for High-Speed Rail that have contacted us recently asking how they can work together with us. Today I have to come here as a representative of those folks and say enough. And propose the only way forward is to hire a professional management organization, task them to do an investment-grade ridership study, and involve an operator in the design of this system. We see the poor results of politicians planning an infrastructure project. In our area, the Millbrae BART station and the San Jose Light Rail are 2 excellent examples of not well-done projects. The California High-Speed Rail Authority continually overpromises and underdelivers. They had 10 years to get a plan in place for the 2008 proposition. People often forget, although you noted today, Senator Lowenthal, that they were supposed to have a plan in 2004, then again in 2006. We've had 18 months under Proposition 1A. We don't have a plan that actually supports building high-speed rail, at least not a statewide system. The route issues, the ridership issues, the funding issues, environmental impact issues, and a risk plan are all up in the air, still questioned. The California High-Speed Rail Authority, as it sits today, deflects, sidesteps, and avoids factual critiques. On April 15th, Mr. Dierdon blamed misinformation on engineers, when in fact he was the one at the public meetings making those quote-unquote misleading statements. In January, Mr. Pringle testified that they acknowledged the need for an investment grade, ridership study. Yet all they want to do is update the model. Mr. Barker in the communications department dismissed ridership model manipulation as a typo, when in fact there are actual number changes. Budget requests, the standard answer I've been to all the meetings has been, we need more information. Today you consider another of many reports about the inadequacy of high-speed rail planning, the waste of past funding, the risks, the confirmation of what concerned citizens have had issue with for some time. The question is, can high-speed rail hire their way out of incompetence? And why does high-speed rail, why shouldn't they be fired is really the basic question. If you want a high-speed rail system in California, you're going to have another organization to do it. Thank you.
Other witnesses?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I'm Jerry Carlson, a council member from the town of Atherton, member of the Peninsula Cities Consortium, and also former corporate controller for Hewlett-Packard Company. My the word incredible is the word that I'll choose to use to sum up the auditor's report. It raises yet another red flag concerning the largest public works project ever attempted in this country. I would hope that Mr. Van Ark, when he comes on board, will be given the support that he needs to have to do the job. He seems to have good credentials. But can the best CEO do an effective job under the present authority board? Will he be allowed to exercise his independent judgment, including reviewing the current business and implementation plans for high-speed rail? Will the board be accepting towards his ideas if they run counter to judgments the board has already made? Will Mr. Van Ark be able to provide the leadership that needs to do this project right? Or will the board tie his hands? I'd like to make 3 suggestions for you to consider. Number 1, meet face-to-face with Mr. Van Ark at the earliest possible date and tell him your concerns and expectations. Tell him you want the project to be done right. Then ask him to meet with you again in 60, 90 days to give you a personal assessment of what he has found that needs to be changed. Is the project on the right track? What does he see to be the risks and how to deal with them? Tell him you want his own personal assessment of the project, regardless of what the board has already decided. You are expecting him to review everything from route selection, consultant contracts, funding needs, funding sources, to operational plans to achieve break-even. Finally, instruct him to work cooperatively with the peer review committee. Secondly, breathe life into the peer review committee. Set a deadline for filling vacant positions, provide adequate funding for the committee in the budget, and give the committee broad powers to perform their oversight role to the maximum extent possible. They should be your eyes and ears, the check and balance you need to oversee the project. Instruct the committee to provide you with a quarterly update. Ask the committee for their assessment as to whether or not the current high-speed rail board structure should be replaced and the agency put under their state agency. Number 3, doing it right implies that the environmental best billable alternative should be funded and constructed. Peninsula residents favor a below-grade placement of the tracks. However, the director of the Peninsula Rail Program is already telling people that the cities will have to come up with the extra funds. The current $45 billion business plan only contemplates an aerial structure. This plan should be modified to show a range of estimates for all the alternatives being considered in each segment. Not having a range of cost estimates is biasing the project-level route selection process. This is not acceptable and will only lead to more opposition and litigation. Hopefully, Mr. Van Ark will recognize and correct this situation. I'll leave you with this final comment. It's the definition of doing it right that an Atherton resident offered the other night at our town rail meeting. Doing it right means you can't see it, you can't hear it, and you can't feel it. And that really sums up the feelings of a lot of the Peninsula residents. Thank you for allowing my comments and for your efforts in trying to bring high-speed rail under control.
Other witnesses.
Good evening, or good afternoon, late afternoon. Late afternoon, Senator Lowenthal and committee. My name is Elizabeth Alexis. I'm from Californians Advocating Responsible Rail Design, otherwise known as CARD. We've spoken to you on a number of these issues before, and this afternoon we are going to focus on the audit. In any audit of any business or inspection of a restaurant, you'll find something wrong. Obviously, any identified deficiencies must be remedied, but a second question must be asked. Are these one-off problems or symptoms of systematic issues? We are coming to the conclusion that the issues identified are just symptoms. The authority has taken a very important step and brought in a new leader with experience in high-speed rail. There is, however, a very short time frame in which to make some serious changes. An accurate diagnosis of the problem is critical to getting on the right track. The first item we would highlight is the current 4-tiered layer of consultants. Each segment has its own consultant and sub-consultant team doing duplicative work. There is a program manager who has tremendous authority but seemingly little accountability. I will note that they were not on the dais this afternoon. KPMG, in their report this fall, spoke of consultants managing consultants and it being unclear who was actually in charge. This is an unmanageable structure. It will be an unmanageable structure with a new CEO, and it would be an unmanageable structure with significant more staff on board. It is wasteful in terms of money and time. It needs to be radically rethought. Second, the RS segments all started first with a solution and then went into the outreach phase, repeating all the mistakes of highway construction. Trying to force these solutions to work in the current time frame will have a poor outcome. Substantial parts of this project, both in terms of rethinking who is doing what and what is being done, will have to take a step backwards to make two forward. We understand this is risky, but there is a very narrow window of time to take action. Cleaning house is a traditional activity for new CEOs. That process needs to start soon.
Thank you. Other witnesses.
Good afternoon. I'm Stacy Mortensen, the Executive Director of the Altamont Commuter Express, and I have been to all 7, and they've been quite informative and have definitely helped my thinking about the whole process. For me, this is where the practical meets the procedural, and oftentimes those worlds are very difficult when they collide. I'm a taxpayer, so I feel like I'm a shareholder in this endeavor, and I appreciate your efforts to protect the taxpayer's investment, make sure it's used wisely. But to me, this is somewhat of a game-changing endeavor, and I appreciated what Senator Huff said about the interstate system. This is something that is brand new, and I would like to encourage you to begin thinking about this a little differently. And it is an entrepreneurial effort. If we were to look at the Googles and Amazons and eBays and Southwests, we would probably see that they have a whole different approach than the box that we're typically used to trying to implement a project in California. There's a lot more flexibility, there's a lot more focus on the end objective, and there's usually a few very rigid rails to operate within, that if you bump against those rails or move outside of them, there are very dire consequences. But a lot of the effort is to shoot for the end game objective, and I come from a somewhat rural county, and we say, get her done. And I understand that that's hard in our framework, and so I think that's where we're bouncing it against the walls a little bit. I can appreciate that you have an immense burden to hold this process accountable. But I can tell you from my perspective, and I have implemented a rail startup, and it was small, so it's nothing along this size, but it is very difficult. And you do not know everything out the gate, and you do not know everything a year down the road, even though some very imposing bodies have told you that you need to know these things. In practice, there are just some things that don't get known until you're further along in the process. If I were on the peer committee, I would probably tell you, I think it's impossible to have a financing plan at this point that means anything because the environmental process is not done. And in California, we hold a great deal of weight on the environmental process, lays out the whole scope. It picks the best alternative, lays out all the potential impacts. And usually then, for everyone else, and for me and my agency, at that point we say, now that these are known, we want a very strict business plan, action plan, strategic plan, risk assessment plan. So it's on one hand, I have been a critic at times of the authority, but on the other hand, I understand that during the environmental process where we're only going to 10 to 15% engineering, we're building a $60 million maintenance facility right now, and we didn't get to that number until we were at the 90 to 100% of the engineering effort. And so I can see where the investors are going to sit on the sidelines for a while until more is known. Usually the private sector with our international partners, they don't jump in until all the environmental work is done, all of this is known, and the policies and procedures are pretty lined up in support. If the policies and procedures look like they're more to pull back, pull down, the private sector doesn't often jump in. That is far too risky for them. So I know they're watching for when all the practical and the procedural issues line up. I can see how some of these things have happened. I've been guilty of them myself. An auditor has called me out on it. I didn't feel very good in the hot seat. Turns out nobody was doing anything really wrong, but we needed to tighten up policies and procedures. I think Carrie and Mehdi and the new Mr. Van Ark, I think they have very good intentions. I think they will tighten it up. I can understand your frustration that it's not right now when you need it. Do I like the model of the consultant on the consultant? No, but this thing takes a lot of resources to get it rolling. I've had a good experience on the Merced to Sacramento section and on the Altamont corridor. When we've needed to contact someone, they've been there. When we've asked for changes in the consulting team and who's doing what work, they've made those changes. They have been responsive to our community members, and we have some real active forums for that input. I know it's not the same in every section. I know that. We knew right out the gate there were going to be some hard segments. It is not going to be easy until you get to the opening day, and then after opening day, it's not going to be easy. Some of those we just know. So I think we're going to have to navigate a gray area, and I know that's uncomfortable for some people. Most of us operate and are successful because of what we know. And I think we need to look for leadership on this effort, somebody that's willing to operate in the gray, be comfortable with the unknowns, be able to take this kind of criticism and make something of it and do something with it. And I do think you have some of the right people to do that. And I do think the program manager, even though the concept is a little icky to me, I've seen them do some good work. I've seen them make progress, at least in my corridor. And I know you have to take it all on balance, and I appreciate that, but I just thought I'd offer my experience with this. And I'm going to keep supporting, and I will keep making constructive criticism, and I will keep attending your hearings.
Thank you. It's nice to know at least somebody's going to keep attending our hearings.
Well, lots of us will attend. I'm Karen Chappelle. I live in Palo Alto. I have no official capacity whatsoever. I am absolutely appalled by the findings of the audit committee, of the audit report. It shows a project which is extremely large and completely out of control. I hope that you will be able to do something to pull it in, because if you don't, we will end up spending our $2.25 billion federal money and matching state funds, and we'll end up with nothing. There'll be a lot of very well-paid consultants, a lot of very well-paid program managers, and no train. I'm also extremely concerned about the context-sensitive solutions, because what it's been up to now has been somebody from the rail authority coming along and saying, well, this is what we're going to do. And we say, but we don't like that. It's not suitable for us. Well, too bad. We don't have money to do it. We don't have money to do it right. We only have money to do it this way. Well, if you haven't got money to do it right, don't do it. We do not want down the peninsula a raised structure. They backed off on the berm because we all complained, but they're still talking about a freeway raised structure and saying, oh, you can have a green belt in the park underneath. Now, who's going to want to be in a park under a functioning train? Nobody. Doesn't make sense. You can't have a baseball team there. You can't even walk there. They also have a tendency to be extremely glib about what they're going to do about freight. Freight needs to stay on the surface. It's not going to go up. It's not going to go down. It goes flat. and it has to be there, and we can't just interrupt it for 6 months or a year so that we can build something nice on top of it. So those are my personal issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Senator Lowenthal and committee members, good afternoon. I'm Alan Bushell, and I came and I've left you the text of what I wanted to say today, but I just wanted to precede that by saying I commend the work of the state auditor. I think they've done us a favor. I come from the private sector, and I've come to give you my input as somebody who's raised a lot of money on Wall Street, debt and equity, and run technology businesses. If it were my business, 3 words would come to mind. Recourse. I would certainly be speaking to my legal counsel on the basis of the auditor's report to find out whether there's recourse I can have. Restitution. It sounds like there's restitution due to the state and to the authority. And termination. If it were in the private sector, I'm sure heads would roll somewhere here. And I am concerned when I hear that an oversight consultant has been put over on a 4-year, $8 million contract. It seems to me that oversight might be necessary in the short term, but to commit to 4 years and $8 million, it should at least be offset against the $199 million for the other contract. What I came to say this afternoon is that in previous meetings and written submissions, I've shared basic financial analysis developed from my experience as a bottom-line-driven corporate executive. I'd like to focus everyone's attention on a few critical elements in bullet form. Many elements have not been taken into the estimated capital cost of the high-speed rail project to arrive at the $42.6 billion. Eminent domain property acquisition, local station and parking facility construction, security equipment and systems, and so it goes on, are not yet in that number. Today, $100 billion might be closer to the mark. Just remember the final leg of the Bay Bridge. It was first $1 billion, then $2 billion, and now it's $6 billion. And don't forget the Boston's Big Dig. It was also managed by Parsons Brinckerhoff, the same people who are the $199 million recipients here. If they didn't learn to do invoicing and billing and everything else on the Big Dig over that duration, then it's a lesson that they're not likely to learn going forward. So if it's $100 billion, and we very conservatively attribute 4% interest to the capital cost. Now, with the state of California's current financial condition, that would be wonderful if we could raise money at 4%. But that would be $4 billion a year of interest with no principal amortization. I'd love to be able to have perpetual capital with no principal amortization. If the extravagant ridership forecasts could be met, this will be $100 of interest per ticket, per passenger in 2035. And in 2025, by their extravagant forecast, this would be $200 of interest alone. That's before anything else. The claim is made that we will create 450,000 new permanent jobs. Well, I'll allow a very low annual full cost, and full cost includes benefits, vacations, Social Security, Medicare contributions, workers' comp, and all of those things. And let's just work with $50,000 a year fully loaded cost for those jobs. This will represent another $50 per ticket in 2035 and $100 per ticket in 2025. So now we add those 2 single items together, and we've got $300 per ticket in 2025 before operating costs, before depreciation, before security, before information systems, before travel and entertainment, before legal expenses, marketing expenses, community outreach. This is why the private sector wants guarantees from the state, because they won't touch this with all of these numbers which don't flesh out. There's no need to compute 2035 because the accumulated deficit by then will have bankrupted the state. The high-speed rail ridership forecasts anticipate taking California back to an enhanced 19th century technology. Where's the assessment of technology progression in these forecasts? The written word was once moved by hand carrying, and then progressively by sail, and by steamship, by stagecoach, by rail, by road, by telegram, by telex, by fax, and email. And today, documents are not even moved, but shared across the net. You see the idea, progression of technology. People also advanced that way as they walked, then they rode, then they sailed, they took steamships, then they took stagecoaches, trains, automobiles, prop planes, jet planes, and in the last 10 years, they're moving forward to utilize telepresence, enhanced video conferencing, and many other exploitations of the internet that reduce the need to physically move bodies. You only have to read the corporate social responsibility reports for companies that are available on the net. I looked particularly just at random, Nike, Cisco, Oracle, and Symantec, to name a few. They're all making significant reductions right now in air miles flown and are investing to see these numbers decline even more dramatically. By 2030, we'll be going about our business in ways that we cannot yet even imagine. We are California. Where's our vision to not even factor elements such as centuries of experience with change into our assessment of the future?
Try to wrap up.
Yeah. We can invest in blanketing the state with the highest speed broadband network that we can afford. This will keep us on the leading edge of world innovation and continually bring growth in high-tech employment. Be bold, save our state, and stop this impending economic disaster now. Thank you.
Thank you. How many more people are going to address? Steve, you're the last. Yes.
Rich Tomac, California Rail Foundation, and want to thank you for holding this hearing. I think that the auditor's report is, in its own way, even more damning than the business plan that was presented previously. And it seems to me that what you have here is a train that you have to stop, and you need a timeout. You need for the existing contracts to be put on hold. You need the new CEO, the new executive director, to take his position, review all the contracts, and see what goes forward. I just think it's really clear that all the activities that are progressing right at the moment are suspect. There's so much that has been done under the name of these environmental studies that's going to be useless. It's going to be reams and reams and rooms full of paper that have no productive use. And I think it's clear that you've needed somebody who really knew the business to lead this effort. I'm hoping that Van Ark will be able to turn this thing around. But in the meantime, I really think you have to put the brakes on expenditures and make sure that they don't get another dime before they've satisfied your committee and the rest of the concerned legislatures.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member Steve Baker with Aaron Reed & Associates, representing the professional engineers in California government. We, too, are supporters of high-speed rail done right. We supported the high-speed rail bond measure. However, at the same time, I go home at night and I see all these campaign commercials about rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, you're staring at it straight in the eyeballs over here. I'm looking at the sub-2 analysis from Senator Simitian's budget subcommittee, where the High-Speed Rail Authority is proposing to spend $131,000 per position for in-house staff. For a few meager in-house staff, $131,000. For these program managers that you're talking about, there's 75 positions at a cost of $40 million for a cost of $520,000 per position. Not for one, per position. For the engineering contracts for design and environmental, there's 368 full-time equivalent employees, all outsourced, a cost of $157 million. That comes out to $426,000 per position. We're having our members being demagogues saying we need to cut pension benefits and have furloughs and have pay cuts. Well, those are the people that are making, somewhere far less than $100,000 with the all-in cost gets you to $131,000 with a truck and an office and a computer and the overhead, versus these other positions at $520,000. Those are the people that are overseeing the other contractors that the auditor and the KPMG report have looked at. So we think the committee ought to take a look and see how you can manage this program better, manage it far more cost effectively, get more bang for your buck so you can actually build this network and get some steel in the ground.
Thank you. Well, we're going to bring that back. Senator Huff, would you like to have say a few words, and then I'll just kind of end it.
Sure. No, I think the comments were very good. They certainly represent the full spectrum of comments we get in the normal part. I mean, I'm looking at some of this stuff. We're sorry to see adversarial relationship. Well, we are too. We don't really mean it to be adversarial, but we don't want this to be the big dig. And I apologize for having put that imagery out earlier in a press release. But, it's just a little too cute, a little too familiar for people. But I believe that if we can get our arms around this process, then we can move together. I appreciate the speaker that said, this is, where was it? The practical meets the procedural. There's a lot of truth in that. This is new for us. We're not experienced. We thought the program manager would have more things in control. They didn't. We don't like 4 levels of oversight. We're trying not to make 5 levels of oversight, and yet there has to be oversight. And so my hope is that as we get these things in place, that our role is still there and still significant, but it's not as much hands-on. That it's, getting reports and filing reports, which is much better than sitting here holding hearings, wondering why things haven't been done. But I'll be happy when we're at a point when we're just filing reports and glowing about all the progress that's been made. There's a comment about, in practice, some things are not going to be known until down the road. Certainly on something of this scope, that's true. And there was many people talking about the risk involved. The more risk that's in there, the more expensive the capital is. I think that's a fair statement. At least that's what I've taken away out of some of these public-private partnership forums that I've attended. To the degree that we could provide to private business a rail and say, now what's it going to take to run it? Then the only risk would be to quantify what the ridership is going to be and, how you can make that work. At this point, we're looking at what's the right-of-way acquisition, what's the timeline, what's the capital going to cost, what's the variables. We don't have the environmental. There's so many variables in here right now. I don't know that we can get an accurate handle on it. And I don't, for me personally, I'm not expecting to know exactly what a ticket's going to cost. Certainly, I hope it's not $100 each just to retire the interest on the bonds. But to the degree that as we go down, we can get this closer and closer, I think that's realistic. But as I mentioned before, it would be nice to see a conservative, a middle, and an aggressive scenario just so we can kind of understand what parameters we're probably looking at. But again, I just want to state that I think we have covered a lot of good things. 60 days is going to be very important. I've tried to take a reasonable tone in this. 60 days from now, if these things have not been changed, you're going to find my tone change. 6 months from now, if we're still struggling over this stuff, then I'm going to become an adversary. And I don't want to be an adversary. I want to be like the union guys that want to get jobs out there. But that's why I will be an adversary if we're not making progress, if we're not getting over these hiccups, if we're not doing what the voters want us to do with this money. They want a high-speed rail system. It's our job as a legislature to protect the voters' interests. They're talking to us all the time. I'm sure they're talking to the high-speed rail officials also. I do think we have a good team in place. I do think there's a learning curve that takes place. I think we're in that. That's the uncomfortable part. But I believe at the end of this process that we will all be stronger for it and that we'll be more accountable for it. And for that, I do appreciate the auditor's report and look forward to the next meeting with bated breath.
Thank you. What shall I begin? Shall I say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help? First I want to thank the state auditor for doing a very fine job, a very comprehensive job. I'd like to thank the interim executive director, Carrie Porvahedi, for being here and honestly responding to some of these issues. I'd like to thank my colleague, Senator Huff. This has been a bipartisan way. We are both supporters of this, of the high-speed rail. We may not always agree on everything, but I think our concerns and our interests are to make sure that we have the best high-speed rail project in the nation. The legislature is often called dysfunctional, and it's called dysfunctional because we pass lots and lots of legislation, but we never check on how it's doing. And what we mean by that is not to be adversarial, or to be promotional. It's just to see how it's working. And our committee has committed itself, not because things are working poorly or things are working well, has committed ourselves that this is one of the, if not the most important project that California will undertake, and that it is our fiduciary responsibility to engage in oversight. That does not mean a one-time meeting just once to talk about this and then to go on our way. That means to be a partner in this. And our role is periodically to see how it's moving, what are the obstacles, what needs to be changed, how can we facilitate this process. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes people see us as not being supportive. We are just trying to do our job. And it may not be the exciting things about passing a magnificent piece of legislation, but to us, it's probably the most important thing that we can do in the legislature as the chair and the vice chair of, we think, the most important committee in the legislature, and that is that deals with the infrastructure and the investments in California's future. So with that, I can just say it's very helpful information. We don't always ask the right questions. We don't meet, but we're going to constantly ask questions. And we want to work with all sides, because at the end, this is not going to be our last hearing. And that's not because things aren't going well. It's because, in many ways, because things are moving along, and we are learning a lot. And we're going to continue to ask questions, and because it is my deep belief that we are much further along than we were 3 years ago when we first started to ask these questions. We understand a great deal more. We've raised issues that need to be raised, and it's much more important from a prevention point of view to ask these questions at the beginning, not at the end of the process. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to do our part to make sure that California is proud of its system. And we're going to ask tough questions, and we're going to demand answers to those questions. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, all the input, all the people that have come to this committee, because they are really committed in terms of their own lives and the lives of how high-speed rail may or may not impact California, and wanting to make this a better process. And so I take everybody's input as very, very important. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.